Hey everyone, I'm Catherine from Research Rockstar. Thanks for joining me for another Conversations with Research Rockstars today. And today we're going to talk about new methods and really trying to get a refresh on what are all the new methods that are out there that complement the traditional market research methods that many of us have been using for 20 or 30 years or more in some cases. So we happen to work in a profession that's in a lot of change right now, right? There's a lot of change going on in terms of a lot of new methodologies that have come out in the last few years, a lot of cool new tools, a lot of companies that are innovating in market research. So let's just take a second to think about how many methodologies we actually have at our disposal today and how some of these new ones complement some of the traditional ones that we have. So what I'd like to do first is just kind of get us oriented by talking about why understanding new methods is so important to us in market research. Yeah, we can talk about the platitude of innovate or die, but again, that's a platitude. It might be true, but it does come off as a little trite. There are some very specific drivers for those of us in market research and customer insights, however. So for example, right now we are seeing a lot of projects that are under pressure to be done as quickly and as low budget as possible. So there's definitely some pressure around speed and cost. So in the past, maybe you might have had 4 months to do a really significant multinational survey project. You may not always have the luxury of 4 months anymore. In fact, there are a lot of cases where we don't. Now, what does that mean? Well, it does mean that either we can use survey-based research but do it more quickly, or we can consider some other methodologies that may be better in terms of immediacy. That is, how quickly we're going to have data to give to our client. So there's some trade-offs there, right? The other reason why we have to be thinking about new methods and trying new methods in our profession is because of rigor. That is, we've learned a lot about how people participate in research. We've learned a lot about the fact that people are irrational, that they tend to over-rationalize their answers on surveys or in focus groups. And so even though data from focus groups and surveys and in-depth interviews is still awesome data, we know there are certain topics that are not appropriate because we're not going to get great quality data back, right? So there's a lot of great uses for surveys and focus groups and in-depth interviews, but there are cases where other methods are perhaps going to give us better data quality. So we have to be honest with ourselves about those new methods and how they can complement or in some cases be used instead of some of our tried and true methodologies. The other issue that many of us face, especially those of us who do a lot of quantitative research, is survey fatigue. It's no secret. Response rates for surveys have plummeted in recent years. Sure, you have sources you can go to get qualified people who will take your surveys. There are a lot of panel companies that do awesome work, but still, there are topics for which I get concerned about survey fatigue. And if I'm trying to reach a very specific target market, especially if I'm working on a hard to find market, I might not want to do a survey because I want a methodology that is most likely to engage people. And in some markets, that's not going to be surveys. Again, there are certain populations that are really over-surveyed. For example, if you do any research in B2B, a lot of B2B populations are really over-surveyed. And so as a market researcher, I really become concerned about data quality in those cases. So maybe I can use an alternate methodology so that I can really understand those populations' attitudes and behaviors in a rigorous way, but without having to deal with these insanely low response rates. So these are some of the reasons why I really believe that it's important for us to use new methods in market research. And I know it can be hard. You know, you're on deadlines, you're juggling projects, and on top of that, you're supposed to be piloting new tools and new methods. It can be really hard. I totally appreciate it. But let's take a look at what some of our options are these days. So first of all, let me ask you a question. How many market research methodologies could you name? If you took a second right now, how many different market research methodologies could you name? Well, surveys, focus groups, in-depth interviews, those are 3, and maybe you could name a couple more. Could you name 8 or 9 or 10? Let's take a look. This is a chart I use in a lot of Research Rockstar classes where we try to orient the students around what the different methodologies are and what the trade-offs. So here what we have on the vertical axis is immediacy. That is, some methods are faster than others. you're going to have your final data more quickly than in some cases than in other cases. And on the horizontal axis, I have suitability for extrapolation, because this is something that's an important consideration when choosing between different research methods. That is this methodology going to give me some really interesting directional data, awesome maybe for discovery, but perhaps not suitable for extrapolating to a larger population of interest? So suitability for extrapolation is an important consideration. So I've taken 8 of the most common market research methods, and I've mapped them on these axes of basically speed and suitability for extrapolation. So anything that is low immediacy means that it's a slower method. So let's take a look. How many of these methods did you name on the previous slide? I bet you got at least a few of them. So from the top, we have secondary research. Now, secondary research is a hugely beneficial option for those of us in market research. I find that sometimes it can be a little underutilized. So if you haven't done much secondary research lately, there are so many wonderful sources these days for really great secondary data. So if you haven't used it recently, I suggest you take a look. And I'll also put a link to our infographic on secondary sources later in the show notes. Social media research, of course, is a really great method. And you'll notice that some of these methods are anchored at 2 ends, because depending on how you actually do them, you might find that they can be done in a way that is more directional versus more suitable for extrapolation. So, for example, with social media research, you can definitely do some, discovery and directional social media research and that's totally fine. Or you can use more robust tools that have, frankly, more robust text analytics engines so that you can really get at that really thorough sentiment analysis and text analysis. In-depth interviews and focus groups, which of course these days can also be online. So with both in-depth interviews and focus groups, you could be doing them in person, you could be doing them online, you can be doing them with a webcam. There are a lot of alternatives and variations these days. Ethnography, great methodology. Prediction markets. If you haven't looked at prediction markets yet, I recommend that you do so. It's not a methodology for all projects. It's kind of a niche, but there are cases where it does give you a certain level of interaction with the target market, especially if you're doing something where you are trying to predict something like, which of these flavors is going to be most popular next year, or which of these products or models of a product are going to sell most in the next 12 months. The important thing with the prediction market is there has to be a known outcome. So you can't just be asking people what you think about it. You're asking them to actually predict. And this is one of those methodologies that really does harness the wisdom of the crowd. If you've not read that book, it was a bestseller like 10 years ago now, but it's an awesome book. Again, Wisdom of the Crowd. And it really does harness that concept, the idea being that a large group of consumers or customers will outpredict. That is, they'll have higher accuracy predictions than 1 or 2 experts. And there have been some really awesome case studies on that. Of course, there's customer data analysis these days. As market researchers, many of us now work with brands that have enormous amounts of in-house data. These might be, if it's like an e-commerce company or a company that sells online, they may have some really amazing sales data from their e-commerce site. They may have other types of customer data that tracks their online activity or their in-store activity, or perhaps from customer loyalty cards. So now we have access to a lot of different customer data that we can analyze. And then of course we have quantitative surveys. So as you can see, even on this simple diagram, I've got 8 common methodologies. And I know for a lot of us, we do tend to focus on just 2 or 3 of them, but I'd really love to see us basically getting ahead of this a little bit, because here's the concern. There are people and professionals outside of the traditional market research world that are doing a really good job leveraging some of these other methodologies. So it's really important for us not to get left behind. All of these are methods that can be used to either discover or measure customer attitudes and behaviors. And that's part of market research, right? That's what we do. We discover and measure customer attitudes and behaviors. So these are all options that we have available to us. And that's 8 right there. And again, I want to make sure that we as a profession are learning how to really take advantage of these things, because people in other professions are also starting to use some of these methods. And again, I don't want us to end up looking like, we're stuck in the world of surveys and focus groups. I want to make sure people know that market research is much more than surveys and focus groups. And there's even more. So that's the 8 that I usually talk about when I'm teaching. But these are 5 more that are also very important methods and may be applicable to work you may be doing. So that's 13 different market research methods in this one diagram now. I didn't really diagram these last 5. I just wanted to put them as an overlay because I haven't really decided how I want to map them in terms of speed and suitability for extrapolation yet. So if you have any ideas, please do share them. But here we have facial analysis. Facial analysis is basically automating how human faces are analyzed in response to stimuli. So you show somebody an ad or an image and you analyze their face using software. Because it's done by software, it's very scalable, and it can also be done by webcam. So you can get 50 or hundreds of people who can view a visual stimuli, and then their face is actually automatically analyzed so that we can see what kind of emotional reaction, rather than show somebody an ad and say, how did you feel about it, or what feelings did it evoke in you? Well, you can actually see what the emotional response is. Is it happiness? Is it disgust? Is it fear, etc.? Idea voting platforms. This also, like prediction markets, is about harnessing the wisdom of the crowd, where we're kind of, instead of asking people what they want and what their purchase is going to be, we're actually asking them to participate in generating ideas and voting for their viability. Mobile ethnography, okay, another type of ethnography, but really hot. And there are a lot of new tools that are out there that are really awesome for mobile ethnography. And again, kind of taking qualitative research and making it even more scalable than ever before. So a really exciting opportunity there. Biometrics. Again, this is the idea of, instead of asking people how they feel about something, let's take their pulse or check their body temperature while they're having an exposure to a visual stimuli. So there have been some cases where people have done some really interesting research looking at, say, pulse rate as a reaction to different types of visual stimuli. I personally haven't done those studies myself, so I don't want to speak too much about them. Social media polls. Okay, this is like the ultimate and quick and dirty research, but if you are working with a brand that has, for example, a really big Facebook following, you can absolutely gather some cool directional data by using Facebook polls. Yes, it's one question at a time, but still can be really useful for a quick hit, some direction, or even just as a conversation starter. So again, 13 different methods and counting available to us doing professional market research and customer insights work. I hope you found that list useful and worthy of a conversation. I welcome more comments. Please add them here. I'm going to add a link to my secondary research infographic in the show notes. And if you want to continue the conversation, please follow me on Twitter at ResearchRocks, or feel free to contact me by email here, kkorostov@researchrockstar.com. Thanks, everybody.